Our next speaker is Guillaume Teasdale, Associate Professor of History at the University of Windsor. He's the author of Roots of Perseverance, the French Peasant in the Detroit River Region, 1701 to 1815, published in 2019. He's currently working on several projects on the history of the Detroit River Region in the 18th and 19th centuries. He's a very prolific contributor on LinkedIn. He gives credit to an awful lot of people for their achievements and accomplishments. I think it's wonderful. Dr. Teasdale.
Okay. I don't know if you recognize Belle Isle. That was 2013. You guys probably heard of that someone wanted to privatize the island. For some reason in Canada we didn't even hear about that, but I thought it was interesting. I found that picture and that image, and I was like, okay, so because it's Belle Isle, private, public, so okay. In the 18th century, Detroit was a small French farming settlement along the river that connects Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. Today, most people think of Detroit as a large industrial city, but in the 1700s, it was a rural colony made up of farms, cattle, and small communities spread along the riverbanks. After Indigenous peoples, the region was inhabited primarily by French-speaking settlers, whose families had originally migrated from the St. Lawrence Valley in Canada, more specifically in Quebec. Many of their ancestors came from the regions of France, such as Normandy, Picardy, and Poitou. On my mom's side, they came from Poitou. They brought with them farming traditions and systems of land organization that had deep roots in rural France. This presentation focuses on the conflict that took place in the late 1760s and early 1770s over a place called Hog Island, already introduced, a former name, known today as Belle Isle in Detroit. At first glance, this may seem like a small local dispute, but when we look closely, the conflict tells us a great deal about daily life, agriculture, land ownership, and community relations in the old French colony of Detroit. Detroit was founded by the French in 1701. The settlement was originally created for strategic and commercial reasons. French officials wanted to control trade routes in the Great Lakes region and strengthen alliances with indigenous nations. But Detroit quickly became more than a military outpost. Over time, French settlers established farms along the river. These farms were organized in long, narrow strips of land stretching back from the water. Historians often call this the ribbon farm system. We don't see the ribbon farms here because this is a map from 1731, and the ribbon farm started to be laid out in 1734. So we kind of see the fort Pontchartrain to the right where it says Grand Marais or Grand Marais. So essentially that was established in 1734 as la Côte du Nord-Est, the northeast coast. 1747, the second settlement was established on the other side of on the left side of the fort. It was called la Côte des Poux for the bottled water meat. And then 1749, where you have La Salle, Ontario today, Petite Côte was established. And the year after, 1750, where you have downtown Windsor, a fort settlement was established. And they were all very similar. This system allowed each family to have access to the river, which was the main transportation route of the period. The river was a highway of the 18th century. By the middle of the 18th century, several farming communities had developed along both sides of the Detroit River, like I just said. On the north side, in Princeton and Michigan, settlers established areas such as the Côte du Nord-Est and the Côte du Pou. On the south side, in present-day Ontario, other settlers founded the Petitcoat and the Assumption settlement. So Assumption, that's the settlement established downtown Windsor. These communities were closely connected through family ties, religion, trade, and agriculture. Many families remained in the region for generations. And I know that some of these people are still here, maybe in this room today, I'm pretty sure. Names such as Campo, Navarre, Réon, Meloche, Cardinal, Saint-Aubin, and Marzac appear repeatedly in the historical records. One aspect not always acknowledged in history books is the central role that livestock played in Detroit's economy. The census of 1750 shows that the colony already had hundreds of cattle, pigs, horses, and oxen. Some families owned large herds. By the 1770s and 1780s, the number of animals had increased dramatically. This means that pasture land was extremely important. The farms along the river were mainly used for crops. Farmers, therefore, needed additional places where they could graze their animals safely. The islands in the Detroit River became especially useful for this purpose. And I should say that in Quebec, along on the St. Lawrence River, there are many instances of islands being used for that purpose. An island surrounded by water made it easier to control animals and reduced the danger that cattle or pigs would damage crops growing on nearby farms. Historical sources show that several islands in the Detroit River were used collectively as pasture land. In 1749, the French military engineer Gaspard Joseph Chaussée-Gros de Lévis mentioned that islands such as Île aux Dames, Turkey Island, were already serving as communal grazing areas for settlers. Hog Island seems to have functioned in a similar way. Hog Island was located in the Detroit River, and is still there with just a different name, directly across from the part of the French settlements of the Côte du Nord-Est and l'Assomption. I would say that it was the closest French settlement was that of Côte du Nord-Est. For decades, local inhabitants brought animals there to graze. According to many settlers, this practice went back to the earliest years of the colony. The important question was this: did the island legally belong to the entire community, or was it simply land that people happened to use informally? For many years, this question probably did not matter very much. People used the island and daily life continued. But everything changed after the British conquest of New France in 1760. To better understand why Hog Island mattered so much, it is important to imagine daily life in 18th century Detroit. Most inhabitants lived on farms stretching along the river banks. Houses were built close to the water, while cultivated fields extended inland behind them. The river connected families to churches, mills, herding posts, and neighboring farms. I would also say that when people were going to church on Sunday, they were using the Detroit River. They would get in a canoe and paddle to the church, basically. Life was physically demanding. Families worked long hours, planting crops, caring for animals, repairing fences, gathering firewood, and preparing food for the winter. Oxen and horses were essential for transportation and agriculture, while cattle and pigs provided meat, milk, leather, and other basic necessities. The population of Detroit was relatively small, which meant that most people knew each other personally. Marriages often linked families together across several generations. The same surnames appeared repeatedly in church records, censuses, and legal documents. Religion also played an important role in structuring community life. St. Anne Church in Detroit served as the principal parish for many years. Later, when the growth of settlements on the south shore of the river, the Assumption Parish was established to serve French-speaking settlers living in what is now Ontario, and the parish still exists today. The Detroit River itself shaped nearly every aspect of life. In winter, people sometimes crossed it on the ice. In the warmer months, canoes and small boats constantly moved along the water, carrying people, crops, animals, and trade goods. Within this environment, access to pasture land was not a minor issue. It directly affected the survival and prosperity of farming families. After the British took control of Detroit in 1760, land ownership practices slowly began to change. Under the French regime, many local customs were based on long-term use and community recognition. In rural French society, it was common for certain spaces, such as forests, marshes, or islands, to be shared collectively. These commons, or communal lands, were an important part of rural life in Europe. In many cases, people did not possess formal written titles proving collective ownership. Instead, rights were based on custom and long-standing practice. Under British rule, however, there was a growing emphasis on formal legal ownership and written property claims. This change created tension in Detroit. In 1776, Indigenous leaders granted Hog Island, or sold Hog Island, to a British officer named George McDougall. McDougall attempted to transform the island into private property. This decision immediately divided the French-speaking farming community. Any discussion of early Detroit must also recognize the major role played by Indigenous nations in the history of the region. Long before the arrival of the French, the Great Lakes region was home to numerous Indigenous communities connected through trade, diplomacy, and kinship networks. Throughout the 18th century, French Detroit depended heavily on alliances with Indigenous nations, especially Anishinaabe groups such as the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. These alliances were essential to the fur trade, military defense, and regional diplomacy. Even after the British conquest, Indigenous nations remained powerful political actors in the region. British officials could not simply ignore Indigenous authority over land. This helps explain why George McDougall attempted to secure a grant for Hog Island from Indigenous leaders in 1768. The transaction reflected the complicated political environment of the post-conquest Great Lakes, where French settlers, British officials, and Indigenous nations all possessed overlapping claims and interests. The conflict over Hog Island was therefore not only a local property dispute, it also formed part of a larger transformation taking place in the Great Lakes after the fall of New France. The conflict over Hog Island produced two major petitions. There's a few others that are smaller, but there's two major petitions. The first petition was written in 1769 and signed by more than 90 inhabitants of Detroit. The petitioners argued that Hog Island had always been used as common pasture land since the earliest years of the colony. According to them, the island had been given to the public during the French period so that inhabitants could graze their animals there. The second petition, written in 1772, so 3 years later, presented a different argument. This smaller group of inhabitants claimed that the island had never officially possessed communal status. They admitted that people sometimes used the island for grazing animals, but they argued that this did not prove collective ownership. In other words, both sides agreed that animals had grazed there. What they disagreed about was the meaning of that practice. Did long-term communal use create collective rights, or did legal ownership require a formal title? This disagreement reflected two very different ways of thinking about property. One of the most interesting aspects of this story is that the conflict was not simply between French settlers and British authorities. Instead, it divided the French-speaking community itself. Some of the most important local families ended up on different sides of the dispute. The petitions reveal the importance of family networks in 18th century Detroit. In many cases, relatives signed the same petition. Brothers, cousins, and neighbors often acted together. This tells us that political and economic life in Detroit was deeply shaped by family ties. The geography of settlement also mattered. People living closest to Hog Island may have viewed the island differently from those living farther away. For nearby farmers, the island was directly connected to their daily agricultural activities. The conflict, therefore, reflected local economic interests as well as legal ideas. Two important figures played major roles in the controversy. The first was Robert Navarre, one of the leading French officials in Detroit. Born in France, Navarre became a royal notary in Detroit in 1734 and played an important administrative role in the colony. Navarre signed the 1772 petition, declaration challenging the idea that Hog Island was a communal property. Another important figure was Philippe de Jean, a French-born notary and legal expert who arrived in Detroit during the British period, so after 1760. De Jean supported the inhabitants who defended the communal status of the island. Because De Jean had more legal training, the 1769 petition in favor of communal rights appears more detailed and legally sophisticated than the petition signed by Navarre. These two men illustrate how the conflict involved not only farmers and cattle owners, but also people deeply connected to the legal and political systems of the colony. So my research shows that remarkable continuity in the Detroit community. Many families present in the 1710 census still appear in records from the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. This means that the conflict over Hog Island was not simply a struggle between old settlers and newcomers. Instead, it was an internal disagreement within a long-established rural society. Several generations of families had lived together in the region. They shared churches, farming practices, and kinship networks. At the same time, they could still disagree strongly about land, rights, and economic interests. And I should say that because I work primarily with French sources, regarding Hog Island, the French, they never say anything about Indigenous people, about claims by Indigenous people. The French, the way they behaved in the area is that they acquired land from Indigenous people, especially after 1760, but then they integrate these land into their own legal system, and then they completely disregard how they acquired the land from Indigenous people. So it's not entirely surprising that regarding Hog Island, the French they don't say anything about Indigenous people. So it looks like they just don't recognize their claims. The story of Hog Island also helps us understand how French rural traditions survived and adapted in North America. In many parts of France under the Ancien Régime, communities used shared pasture lands and common resources. Certain spaces, especially lands difficult to cultivate, were often used collectively. The settlers of Detroit seem to have adapted some of these practices to the environment of the Great Lakes. River islands became practical communal grazing areas. Interestingly, 19th century visitors to Detroit still noticed strong French cultural influences in the region. Some observers even claim that the local French language sounded similar to Normand French spoken in parts of France, so from Normandy. These cultural continuities remind us that French Detroit was not just an isolated frontier settlement. It was connected to much older traditions and ways of life. I should say that I presented a slightly different version of this presentation in Paris a few months ago. And after my presentation, a few historians from Paris came to tell me that they made a lot of connections with regions of France that they study about collective ownership and things like that. So they were like, wow, we were surprised to know that it happened in Detroit because it reminded them so much of a few stories in France. At first glance, a dispute over an island used for grazing animals may seem like a minor event. But the conflict over Hog Island reveals several important historical themes. First, it shows how important agriculture and livestock were in early Detroit. Second, it demonstrates that French-speaking communities in the Great Lakes region possessed strong traditions of corporation and collective land use. Third, it reveals how the British conquest transformed ideas about property and land ownership. Finally, the conflict reminds us that local history is often deeply human. The people involved in these petitions were neighbors, relatives, and members of the same community. They attended the same churches and lived along the same river, yet they interpreted their history and their rights in very different ways. The story of Hog Island is ultimately about more than one island. It is about the transformation of Detroit from a French colonial farming settlement into a British-controlled frontier society. It is about the survival of French rural traditions in North America. And it is about how ordinary people understood land, community, and rights in the 18th century. When we study these petitions and conflicts, we gain a better understanding of the everyday lives of the French families who helped build early Detroit. Their world was shaped by farming, cattle, rivers, kinship, religion, local customs, of course, trade with indigenous communities. The debate over Hog Island gives us a rare window into that world. Today, Belle Isle is known as a public park visited by thousands of people every year. Few visitors realize that more than 250 years ago, this same island stood at the center of a major debate within Detroit's French-speaking farming community. Yet the story survives in the archives, allowing us to reconnect with the lives and struggles of the people who shaped the early history of the Detroit River region. And before I conclude, I finish. Actually, this here. It's a document that I photographed about 2 years ago in the archives of the Archdiocese of Detroit. And I was looking at it a few weeks ago, and it's early 19th century. It's in French. And you can see the bottom half is essentially signatures. It's because it's a petition. And guess what? It's a petition about public property addressed to the U.S. government for similar reasons. It's not about an island. I still have to further analyze the document, but the French, they were quick to basically fight for their rights. Petitions took place throughout the 18th century and early 19th century. In my book, I have a couple of crazy stories about French people fighting for their rights, but I can't wait to further analyze this and hopefully publish an article on that. Thank you very much.